Courtney Rivers had been through a lot in the past year. Her divorce, though not entirely unexpected, had left her emotionally drained. She was ready for a new chapter, something quieter, something hers. So when she found the charming suburban house with its sparkling backyard pool, it felt like a lifeline. The moment she stepped onto the property, she envisioned herself floating in that crystal-clear water, sipping iced tea under the sun. It wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary, a promise of peace. She'd worked hard for this moment, and now, for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that life could be simple again. The neighborhood seemed pleasant enough at first glance. Manicured lawns, pastel houses, neighbors who waved politely but didn't pry. It was exactly what Courtney wanted. Moving day went smoothly. By the evening, she was already lounging on the deck with a glass of wine, savoring the gentle hum of crickets and the soft ripple of water in her pool. It wasn't perfect yet, the garden needed tending, and the house had a few quirks, but it was hers, and that was enough. For the first time in years, Courtney felt like she could breathe. The next day, while unpacking boxes in her kitchen, Courtney noticed an older woman at her front gate. The woman, with neatly styled hair and an air of authority, waved enthusiastically. Courtney hesitated but eventually walked over to introduce herself. "Hello, dear, I'm Janet. I live just 2 houses down," the woman chirped, her smile wide but her gaze sharp. "I just wanted to come by and welcome you to the neighborhood. And might I say, what a lovely pool you have." "Thank you," Courtney replied, taken slightly aback by the directness of the comment. Janet's eyes lingered on the pool visible through the side gate. "My grandkids are visiting this weekend, you know. They've been begging for something fun to do. Would you mind terribly if they came by to swim? I'd of course stay to supervise." Courtney blinked, caught off guard by the request. She had just met this woman. The idea of sharing her private space, her hard-earned oasis, felt wrong. But she didn't want to be rude. "I appreciate you asking," she said carefully, "but the pool is private. I'm still settling in, and I'd prefer to keep it that way." Janet's smile faltered, her friendly demeanor cracking for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Oh, of course, dear. I completely understand. But, around here we like to look out for each other. Good neighbors share, don't they?" Courtney forced a polite smile. "I'll keep that in mind. It was nice meeting you." Janet lingered for a moment longer than necessary before finally walking away, but not without one last glance at the pool. Courtney couldn't shake the feeling that the interaction had been more than a casual neighborly introduction. Something about Janet's tone, her choice of words, felt off. As the days went by, Courtney settled into her new routine. She spent her mornings working on her freelance design projects and her evenings by the pool, relishing the quiet, but Janet's presence became a constant. She always seemed to be nearby, watering her plants, walking her dog, or chatting with other neighbors just within view of Courtney's property. More than once, Courtney caught Janet peering through the gaps in the fence, her gaze fixed on the pool. It made her uncomfortable, but she told herself she was being paranoid. Janet was just a curious older woman, nothing more. That illusion was shattered one evening when Courtney returned from a quick trip to the store to find her backyard gate slightly ajar. Her heart sank as she stepped onto the deck and saw wet footprints leading away from the pool. Someone had been there. She rushed to check her house, but nothing seemed out of place. The thought that someone had trespassed on her property, violated her space, was deeply unsettling. The next morning, Courtney found a note taped to her front door. Written in large, looping handwriting, it read, "Good neighbors don't hoard their blessings." There was no signature, but Courtney didn't need one. Her mind immediately went to Janet. Courtney decided it was time to set firmer boundaries. The following day, she approached Janet's house, note in hand. When Janet answered the door, her expression was a perfect blend of surprise and innocence. "Good morning, dear. What brings you by?" Courtney held up the note. "I found this on my door. Do you know anything about it?" Janet's smile didn't waver. "Why, I have no idea what you're talking about. But it's a lovely sentiment, isn't it? Sharing is so important in a community like ours." Courtney felt her patience wearing thin. "Janet, I need to be clear. My pool is private property. I don't appreciate anyone trespassing or leaving notes like this. I hope we can respect each other's boundaries moving forward." Janet's expression hardened just enough for Courtney to notice. "Oh, absolutely, dear. Boundaries are so important. I'm sure we'll get along just fine." The words were polite, but the tone carried an undercurrent of something darker. Courtney walked away, her stomach twisting with unease. She had a sinking feeling that this was far from over. That night, as she lay in bed, Courtney couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The faint sound of laughter carried through the night air, too close to be from another house. She got up, peered out the window, and froze. Janet was standing on the sidewalk, her eyes fixed on Courtney's home, a faint smirk playing on her lips. The first few days after the note incident, Courtney tried to push the uncomfortable interaction with Janet to the back of her mind. She focused on settling into her new routine, meticulously organizing her home and enjoying quiet evenings by the pool. The thought of Janet's strange fixation on her pool still lingered, but Courtney chalked it up to an overzealous neighbor who might just need a firm boundary. After all, people didn't just ignore such clear refusals, did they? It was a warm Thursday afternoon when Courtney first noticed something wrong with the pool. She had just returned from running errands, looking forward to cooling off with a quick swim. But as she stepped outside onto the deck, she stopped in her tracks. The water, normally a pristine blue, was cloudy and murky, with a faint chemical smell hanging in the air. Her first thought was that the pool filter might be malfunctioning, but when she checked, everything appeared to be in working order. Baffled, she decided to call a professional to inspect it. The pool technician arrived later that evening. After running a few tests and inspecting the equipment, he came to a troubling conclusion. "Someone's poured an excessive amount of chlorine and other chemicals into your pool," he said, frowning. "This isn't something that happens by accident, it's deliberate." Courtney's stomach tightened. "Deliberate? Are you sure? Could it have been some sort of malfunction in the system?" He shook his head. "No way. The system's fine. Someone physically added chemicals to the water. Probably over the fence or through the gate." He paused, eyeing her. "Do you have any neighbors who might have done this? It's not a prank you see every day." Courtney felt her throat tighten. One name immediately came to mind, but she wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. I don't know. I just moved in," she said cautiously, avoiding eye contact. "But I'll take extra precautions from now on." The technician nodded sympathetically. Might be a good idea to install cameras just to be safe. Whoever did this could come back. Courtney thanked him and paid for the service, but his words stayed with her long after he left. Cameras. She hadn't thought she'd need that level of security in such a seemingly quiet neighborhood, but maybe she was wrong. Maybe her new start wasn't going to be as peaceful as she had hoped. That evening, she called a local security company to inquire about installing cameras around her property. The representative on the phone was helpful and understanding, scheduling a consultation for the next morning. As Courtney hung up, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She stepped out onto her deck, the cool night air doing little to calm her nerves. The stillness of the neighborhood felt suffocating rather than peaceful, and the shadows cast by the streetlights seemed to stretch further than usual. The next morning, as she sipped her coffee and waited for the security technician to arrive, Courtney caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Looking out her window, she saw Janet standing at the edge of the sidewalk, staring at her house. Not her pool this time, her house. Janet wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, she wasn't even smiling. But the way she stood there, arms crossed, staring with an unnerving stillness, sent a chill down Courtney's spine. When Janet finally walked away, Courtney exhaled sharply, realizing she had been holding her breath. She was tempted to confront Janet again, but decided against it. The last thing she needed was to escalate the situation before she had concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. Later that day, the security technician arrived and began installing cameras around the perimeter of her property. Courtney felt a small sense of relief watching the technician mount the sleek, black devices. She'd have eyes on her pool, her gate, and her deck. If anything happened again, she'd know exactly who was behind it. She hoped that having cameras would not only deter whoever was messing with her property, but also ease the constant knot of anxiety in her chest. For a few days, things were quiet. Courtney began to relax. convincing herself that perhaps the chemical incident had been a one-off or a prank that wouldn't be repeated. But then, late one night, her new security system sent a notification to her phone. Motion detected. Heart racing, Courtney opened the app to check the live feed. The screen showed the side gate to her backyard. There was someone there. Squinting at the grainy footage, she could just make out a figure moving quickly in the shadows, their features obscured by a hoodie pulled tightly over their head. The figure appeared to fiddle with the latch on the gate before giving up and retreating back toward the street. Courtney felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that they hadn't made it into her backyard, but fear that someone had actually tried. And though the figure was unrecognizable, Courtney couldn't shake the suspicion that Janet was behind it. The next morning, Courtney went outside to inspect the gate. She found fresh scratches on the latch and a small piece of broken metal that looked like it might have been part of a tool. Her stomach churned. This wasn't a random attempt at burglary, this was targeted. Someone wanted access to her backyard. To her pool. That same day, Courtney received an unexpected knock at her door. It was Janet. She stood there with a basket of cookies, her smile wide and her demeanor infuriatingly cheerful. "Good morning, dear," Janet chirped. "I just wanted to bring you these as a little welcome gift. I've been meaning to properly welcome you ever since you moved in, but, life gets so busy." Courtney stared at her, stunned by the audacity. She wanted to confront Janet about the gate, about the chemicals, about the constant staring. But instead she forced a tight smile and said, "Thank you. That's very kind of you." She didn't invite Janet in. As soon as Janet left, Courtney tossed the cookies into the trash. She wasn't going to take any chances. That evening, Courtney decided it was time to document everything. She started a detailed log, noting every interaction with Janet, every suspicious incident, and every piece of evidence the cameras caught. Her lawyer had told her to keep records if anything escalated, and now Courtney was glad she'd taken that advice seriously. The next major incident happened just 2 days later. Courtney came home from running errands to find a handwritten note taped to her front door. The message, written in bold, looping handwriting, read: "Selfish people don't belong here. Share what you have, or it will be taken." Courtney's blood ran cold. This wasn't just passive-aggressive anymore, it was a direct threat. She immediately called the police. When the officer arrived, she showed him the note and explained everything that had happened so far. The officer was sympathetic but admitted there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence linking Janet to the incidents. "Just keep documenting everything," the officer said. "And let us know if anything escalates further." Escalates further. The words echoed in Courtney's mind as she watched the officer leave. What did further even look like? Was she supposed to wait until something worse happened? Until someone got hurt? That night, Courtney found herself unable to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside sent her heart racing. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what Janet or whoever was behind this would do next. Courtney woke up to a banging sound on her front door early the next morning. The sun had barely risen, and the noise shattered the brief, uneasy sleep she'd managed to get. Throwing on a robe, she hurried downstairs, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it the police following up? Janet? Or something worse? Opening the door, she was greeted by 2 men in overalls standing awkwardly on her porch. A large truck idled in her driveway, its logo reading City Utilities. The taller man held a clipboard. "MS Rivers?" he asked. "Yes," she replied cautiously, clutching her robe tighter around her. "We've received multiple complaints about your property causing flooding in neighboring yards. We're here to check your plumbing and irrigation system for possible leaks." Courtney blinked, stunned. "Flooding? That's impossible. I don't have any leaks." The man raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this was reported as an urgent issue. We'll need to inspect the backyard." Courtney's stomach churned. Complaints. She already knew who was behind this. Taking a deep breath to steady her voice, she said, "I understand, but I'm going to need some proof of the complaint before I let you onto my property." The second man, who had been silent until now, frowned and muttered, "We're just doing our job, lady," but the taller one seemed to realize she wasn't going to be pushed so easily. "Let me call the office and confirm," he said. walking back to the truck with his phone in hand. As Courtney waited, her gaze shifted toward the street. Sure enough, there was Janet, standing on her own driveway, pretending to water her already drenched plants. Her eyes darted toward Courtney's house every few seconds. Courtney felt a flash of anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Confronting Janet here and now wouldn't do any good. A few minutes later, the taller man returned, looking sheepish. "Mom, I'm sorry for the trouble. It seems there's been a mix-up. There's no actual record of a formal complaint. Have a good day." Courtney nodded curtly as the men climbed back into their truck and drove off. She could feel Janet's gaze burning into her as she stepped back inside and locked the door behind her. This wasn't a mix-up. Janet had escalated her game, and now she was dragging others into it. Courtney knew she had to be more vigilant than ever. The day passed uneventfully, but the sense of unease lingered. Courtney spent the afternoon reviewing the footage from her security cameras. Sure enough, at around midnight the night before, a figure almost certainly Janet had approached her property and appeared to scatter something near her fence line. Courtney couldn't make out exactly what it was, but the motion was deliberate, purposeful. She saved the clip and sent it to her lawyer, attaching a brief explanation of what had happened with the utility workers. As the sun set, Courtney tried to distract herself by working on a design project. But the quiet of her home felt oppressive, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Janet was just biding her time, waiting for another opportunity. Sure enough, just after 9 p.m., the motion detector on her side yard camera went off. Courtney grabbed her phone and opened the app, her pulse quickening. The live feed showed Janet standing near the fence, partially obscured by the shrubs. She appeared to be holding something. Courtney couldn't quite make it out, but then Janet raised her hand and threw it over the fence. A moment later, she disappeared back into the shadows. Courtney's stomach dropped. She rushed outside, flashlight in hand, to see what Janet had tossed onto her property. There, lying near the pool, was a pile of raw meat. Courtney's heart raced as she carefully inspected it. Some of the pieces looked unnaturally pale and powdery, as if they'd been coated with something. The implication was clear. Janet was trying to harm Courtney's property, or worse, her pets, if she had any. Disgusted, Courtney snapped several photos of the meat before carefully collecting it in a sealed bag. She would take it to the authorities in the morning. The next day, Courtney filed a formal report with the police. This time she had more than just suspicions, she had evidence. The officers took the photos and the bagged meat, promising to investigate further. Though they didn't outright say it, Courtney could tell they were beginning to take her case more seriously. They suggested she avoid any direct confrontations with Janet and continue documenting everything. That advice became harder to follow as the days went on. Janet's antics only grew bolder. Courtney started waking up to find her trash bins overturned, their contents scattered across her driveway. Once she even found her garden hose sliced cleanly in half, leaving water pooling across her yard. Each time, she documented the damage and sent the evidence to both the police and her lawyer. But the constant stress was beginning to wear on her. One afternoon, as Courtney was watering her plants, Janet approached the fence with an air of smug confidence. "You know," she said, leaning casually against the gate, "you'd have a much easier time here if you just stopped being so difficult. People don't like it when new neighbors act like they're better than everyone else." Courtney set down the watering can, her hands trembling with a mix of anger and exhaustion. "Janet, I've tried to be polite, but this harassment needs to stop. If it doesn't, I will take legal action." Janet's expression darkened. "Harassment? Oh, honey, I think you're confused. I'm just trying to help you fit in. But if you want to make this into a bigger deal, go ahead. Just don't be surprised when people take my side." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Courtney standing there, stunned. Janet's threat was subtle but unmistakable. She was leveraging her influence in the neighborhood to isolate Courtney even further. That evening, Courtney received a letter in her mailbox. The envelope was unmarked, and the note inside was handwritten in the same looping script as the one she'd found taped to her door. This one read, "You can't win. Leave now or things will only get worse." Courtney felt a chill run down her spine. The veiled threats were becoming more direct, and the knowledge that Janet or someone working with her was brazen enough to deliver these messages right to her home made Courtney feel trapped. She forwarded a photo of the note to her lawyer, who immediately suggested filing for a restraining order. But even as she followed her lawyer's advice, Courtney couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Janet wasn't just harassing her for the sake of it, there was something more to this, something that hadn't yet come to light. And whatever it was, Courtney knew she had to be ready for it. She spent the rest of the night reinforcing her property, installing additional locks on her gates, repositioning her cameras for better angles, and even placing motion-activated lights around her backyard. As she worked, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see Janet watching from the shadows. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. Exhausted, Courtney collapsed onto her bed, but sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much worse things could get and how far Janet would go to make her feel unwelcome. Courtney had begun to feel like a prisoner in her own home. Every movement outside, every noise in the night made her jump. Janet's campaign of harassment had escalated far beyond passive-aggressive notes and pranks. It was psychological warfare now, and Courtney couldn't deny the toll it was taking. Her peaceful oasis, the home she had dreamed of, felt like a battleground. But Courtney wasn't one to back down. If Janet thought she could bully her out of her own home, she had severely underestimated her. Courtney resolved to hold her ground, no matter how exhausting or maddening it became. Her lawyer had been invaluable in guiding her through the proper channels, helping her file restraining orders and ensuring every incident was documented. But even with legal steps in motion, Janet continued to push the boundaries. The restraining order prevented her from stepping directly onto Courtney's property, but it didn't stop her from orchestrating other ways to terrorize her. One evening, as Courtney sat by her living room window sipping tea, she saw Janet standing with a group of neighbors across the street. They were huddled together, whispering and glancing occasionally toward Courtney's house. Janet was gesturing animatedly, her voice carrying just loud enough for Courtney to catch snippets of her words. Completely selfish. Ruining the neighborhood. Doesn't understand community values. Courtney's jaw tightened as the neighbors nodded in agreement. Janet was rallying others against her, using her charm and influence to turn the neighborhood into a hostile environment. The next morning, Courtney woke to find a letter taped to her mailbox. It was an official-looking document from the neighborhood committee, claiming that Courtney's pool violated community regulations and demanding she either drain it or apply for a permit to use it. Courtney knew this was absurd. Her lawyer had already confirmed that her property, including the pool, was entirely private and exempt from any shared community rules. This was Janet's handiwork, a desperate attempt to create more trouble. She immediately forwarded the letter to her lawyer, who assured her they'd address it. But as Courtney stared at the letter in her hands, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. It wasn't just the letter. It was everything: the constant pressure, the feeling of being watched, the endless stream of petty harassment. She felt like she was drowning, and Janet was holding her under. That night, Courtney sat in her backyard, gazing at the pool that had once brought her so much joy. The water shimmered under the glow of her outdoor lights, a perfect picture of serenity. But she couldn't enjoy it anymore. Every time she looked at the pool, she thought of Janet. Of her smug face. Of the chaos she had caused. Courtney clenched her fists, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. She wasn't going to let Janet win. The next day, Courtney decided to take the fight directly to Janet. She wasn't going to scream or yell. She wasn't going to stoop to her level. But she was going to make it clear that she wasn't going anywhere. Armed with her lawyer's advice and a growing sense of determination, she walked to Janet's house and knocked firmly on the door. Janet opened it with that same fake, syrupy smile Courtney had come to despise. "Well, hello, Courtney. What a surprise." "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Janet asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. Courtney didn't waste any time. "I'm here to tell you this needs to stop, Janet. The notes, the false complaints, the harassment, it all ends now. If you think I'm going to roll over and let you push me out of my home, you're mistaken." Janet's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Harassment? My dear, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm simply doing my duty as a concerned neighbor. This is a community, Courtney, and we all have to abide by certain standards. Courtney took a step closer. I've spoken to my lawyer, I've filed restraining orders, and I've documented every single thing you've done. So let me make myself clear: if you continue this, I will take further legal action. And trust me, Janet, you don't want that. For a moment, Janet said nothing. Then, her smile twisted into something colder, more calculated. You really think you're going to scare me? This neighborhood isn't just about rules, Courtney. It's about relationships. And let me tell you, dear, you've made quite a few enemies here. Maybe you should think about why that is. Courtney stared at her, unflinching. I'll take my chances. With that, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had stood her ground, but Janet's words lingered, a reminder of just how deeply rooted her influence was in the community. The next few days were uneventful, but Courtney knew better than to let her guard down. Sure enough, the calm didn't last. Late one night, her motion detector lights flared on, waking her from a restless sleep. Groggily, she reached for her phone and opened the camera feed. What she saw made her blood run cold. 2 figures stood near her pool. They weren't trying to hide, moving openly as if they had every right to be there. One of them was holding what looked like a long pole, dipping it into the water and stirring it. The other stood by watching. Courtney couldn't make out their faces, but she didn't need to. This was no random act of vandalism, it was deliberate. Her first instinct was to rush outside, but she forced herself to stay calm. She didn't know if they were armed, or how far they were willing to go. Instead, she called the police, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. To her relief, officers arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. By the time the police reached her backyard, the intruders were gone. But they had left evidence behind a broken tool near the pool and faint footprints leading back toward the street. The officers took her statement and assured her they'd patrol the area more frequently, but Courtney could see the skepticism in their eyes. To them, this was just another case of neighborhood drama. They didn't understand how calculated and personal it was. The next morning, Courtney discovered what the intruders had been doing. Her pool water was a strange, murky green, and there was a chemical stench so strong it made her eyes water. Furious, she called her pool technician, who confirmed her worst fears. Someone dumped a massive amount of industrial cleaning agents into your pool, he said grimly. This stuff is dangerous. You're lucky you didn't go swimming. Courtney's hands shook as she wrote another email to her lawyer, detailing the latest incident. She included the footage, the technician's report, and her police file number. She knew she was doing everything right, documenting, reporting, following legal advice, but it still didn't feel like enough. Janet was relentless, and Courtney couldn't shake the feeling that this was building toward something bigger. Her fears were confirmed later that week when she overheard 2 neighbors talking in hushed tones outside the local grocery store. I heard she's getting sued, one of them said, glancing toward Courtney. Apparently the pool's a health hazard or something. Janet's trying to protect the community. Courtney felt her heart sink. A lawsuit. Janet was escalating her campaign to new heights, and Courtney had no doubt she was behind the rumors, too. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. Janet was trying to destroy her reputation, to isolate her completely. But as overwhelming as it all felt, Courtney knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let Janet win. Not now. Not ever. The lawsuit hit Courtney harder than she had anticipated. Though her lawyer had warned her Janet might escalate her tactics, seeing the official notice in her mailbox felt like a gut punch. The complaint alleged that Courtney's pool was a public health risk, due to improper maintenance, unregulated drainage, and potential chemical contamination affecting neighboring properties. The claims were baseless, but they were detailed and clearly designed to cause maximum inconvenience. Janet's name wasn't on the lawsuit itself. It was filed by a coalition of neighbors, most of whom Courtney had never even met. But Courtney had no doubt who was orchestrating it all. This was Janet's next move, and it was a calculated one. Courtney's lawyer, Elise, reviewed the lawsuit with a practiced eye. This is a weak case, she assured Courtney during their meeting. They don't have any real evidence to support these claims, but it's going to be a headache. We'll need to gather documentation to prove your pool is in compliance with all regulations, which means more inspections and paperwork." Elise paused, tapping her pen against her notebook. "And it's not just about the lawsuit. Janet's clearly trying to wear you down. She wants you to give up, either by selling your house or submitting to her demands." "I'm not giving up," Courtney said firmly. "This is my home. I won't let her take that from me." Elise nodded. "Good. Then we fight this." The days that followed were a blur of inspections, paperwork, and meetings with Elise. Courtney submitted her pool's maintenance records, drainage reports, and water quality tests, all of which proved her pool was perfectly safe and well-maintained. She even paid for an independent inspector to evaluate her property, just to ensure there were no weak spots in her defense. Every step felt like a small victory, but Courtney knew the fight was far from over. Meanwhile, Janet continued her campaign of harassment. Courtney began noticing more subtle, insidious signs that Janet was mobilizing the neighborhood against her. One morning, she found a flyer tucked under her windshield wiper while parked at the grocery store. The flyer, printed on cheap paper with bold, capitalized letters, read, "Do you feel safe? Irresponsible new neighbor puts community at risk." It listed exaggerated and outright false claims about her pool, including supposed violations and fabricated incidents of children falling ill from toxic fumes. The flyer ended with a plea to support the lawsuit to protect our neighborhood. Courtney's blood boiled as she crumpled the paper in her hand. The next day, Courtney heard shouting from outside her house. She looked out the window to see a small group of neighbors standing near the street, waving signs that read, "Respect our community and unsafe pools have no place here." At the center of the group was Janet, leading the charge with her signature smug expression. It wasn't a large protest, maybe 6 or 7 people, but it was loud enough to attract attention from passing cars and pedestrians. Courtney's first instinct was to storm outside and confront them, but she stopped herself. She knew that's exactly what Janet wanted. Instead, she grabbed her phone and began recording the scene from her porch. Janet noticed and immediately shifted her tactics, shouting loud enough for Courtney to hear she's filming us, trying to intimidate peaceful protesters. Typical behavior from someone who doesn't care about the community. Courtney ignored her, keeping the camera steady. She didn't say a word, but her hands were shaking as she recorded. Once the protesters dispersed, she sent the footage to Elise. "This isn't about the pool," Courtney wrote in her email. "She's turning this into a personal attack. She's trying to ruin my reputation." Elise responded quickly. "Document everything. This behavior could be used to show harassment in court. Stay calm, but don't engage directly." Courtney took the advice to heart, but it wasn't easy. The stress was mounting, and Janet's tactics were becoming more aggressive. One morning, Courtney woke to find her front yard littered with trash, empty cans, broken glass, and what looked like shredded pages from a magazine. Among the mess was a large, spray-painted message on her driveway. "Get out." Her stomach dropped as she stared at the words, the red paint stark against the concrete. She immediately called the police, who arrived within the hour. The officer who took her statement was sympathetic but realistic. "Without any witnesses or footage, it's hard to prove who did this," he said. "But given the restraining order you have against Janet, she's the obvious suspect. I'll add this to the report, but I suggest you install more cameras or even hire private security if things escalate further." Courtney nodded, her frustration growing. "I already have cameras, but they didn't catch whoever did this. They must have come from an angle I missed." "Then expand your coverage," the officer advised. "This is serious, ma-am. You shouldn't take these threats lightly." As soon as the officer left, Courtney called her security company and scheduled an appointment to add more cameras to her property. She also began looking into motion-activated floodlights and alarms. If Janet or whoever was helping her wanted to escalate this fight, Courtney would be ready. A few nights later, the motion detectors on her existing cameras went off again. Courtney, now accustomed to late-night alerts, grabbed her phone and checked the live feed. This time the footage was clear. 2 figures wearing hooded sweatshirts were sneaking around her backyard, near the pool. One of them appeared to be pouring something into the water, while the others stood watch. Courtney's heart raced as she recorded the footage and called the police. The intruders were gone by the time officers arrived, but the evidence was damning. The footage clearly showed their actions, and Courtney wasted no time sharing it with Elise. "This proves they're targeting my pool," she told her lawyer. "It's not just vandalism, it's sabotage." The next morning, Courtney had the pool inspected again. The technician confirmed her worst fears: someone had dumped a concentrated chemical agent into the water, rendering it unsafe and requiring an expensive draining and cleaning process. The cost was staggering, but Courtney knew she couldn't leave the pool in its current state. It was another blow, another calculated move by Janet to push her closer to the edge. But Courtney refused to break. She drained the pool, scheduled the cleaning, and documented every step of the process. With Elise's help, she filed additional police reports and prepared to include the new footage in her ongoing legal battle. As she sat on her porch that evening, watching the now empty pool under the glow of her newly installed floodlights, Courtney felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Janet had pushed her to the brink, but Courtney wasn't giving up. This was her home, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The next morning, a letter arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't from the court or her lawyer. It was another anonymous note, written in the same looping handwriting as before. This one was shorter than the others, but it hit just as hard. "We warned you. Leave or next time will be worse." Courtney stared at the note, her hands trembling. It was a threat, plain and simple. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of defiance. Janet had underestimated her strength, her resilience. Courtney wasn't going anywhere. If Janet wanted a war, Courtney would give her one. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sharp chill in the air, matching the tension Courtney felt in her chest. After weeks of harassment, threats, and sabotage, this was her chance to turn the tables on Janet. Her lawyer, Elise, had prepared meticulously, collecting every piece of evidence. Courtney had painstakingly documented footage of the hooded figures by the pool, photos of the vandalism, copies of the threatening notes, and the results of the independent inspections that proved Courtney's pool was safe and compliant. This wasn't just about defending her property anymore, it was about exposing Janet for what she truly was. The small courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as neighbors filed in, drawn by curiosity and, no doubt, Janet's encouragement to support their community. Janet herself sat near the front, dressed impeccably in a sharp blazer, her expression calm and confident, as if she had already won. She exchanged smiles and whispers with a few of the neighbors who had joined her lawsuit. Courtney sat several rows back with Elise, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Janet's composure was unnerving, but Courtney reminded herself that the truth was on her side. The hearing began with Janet's lawyer presenting the case against Courtney. He spoke at length about the alleged risks posed by the pool, painting Courtney as a negligent homeowner whose disregard for community safety had forced the neighbors to take action. He even referenced fabricated incidents, claims that children had become sick from toxic runoff, and that Courtney had ignored multiple warnings to address the supposed issues. The neighbors seated behind Janet nodded along, their expressions a mix of concern and self-righteousness. When it was Elise's turn, she wasted no time dismantling their arguments. She began by presenting the independent inspection reports, each one confirming that Courtney's pool was fully compliant with all local regulations. She showed detailed photographs of the pool's filtration and drainage systems, which had been checked and cleared by professionals. Then she turned to the vandalism and harassment, methodically laying out each incident, complete with timestamps, photos, and video evidence. "This is not a case about safety or community concerns," Elise said, her voice steady and confident. "This is a targeted campaign of harassment, orchestrated by Janet and carried out with the intent of forcing my client out of her home. The evidence speaks for itself." The judge's expression grew increasingly serious as Elise continued. When she played the footage of the hooded figures tampering with the pool, an audible gasp rippled through the courtroom. Janet shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confident facade cracking for the first time. Elise followed up with the threatening notes, the vandalized driveway, and the reports filed with the police. By the time she was finished, it was clear that this was not just a dispute over a pool, it was a sustained effort to intimidate and harm Courtney. When Janet was called to the stand, her demeanor shifted. Gone was the polite, composed neighbor Courtney had first met. Instead, Janet became defensive and evasive, denying any involvement in the harassment and claiming she had only acted in the best interests of the neighborhood. But Elise was relentless. She questioned Janet about the flyers, the protests, and the false complaints to city inspectors, forcing her to admit that she had encouraged the neighbors to file grievances against Courtney. The turning point came when Elise revealed a crucial piece of evidence: emails obtained through a subpoena that showed Janet had been in communication with a local real estate developer. The emails outlined a scheme to drive down property values in the neighborhood by creating conflict and targeting new homeowners like Courtney. In exchange, the developer had promised Janet a commission for every property they acquired, including Courtney's. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and Janet's face turned ashen. "You spent weeks accusing my client of endangering this community," Elise said, her voice cutting through the noise. "But the truth is, you've been exploiting it for your own financial gain. You manipulated your neighbors, weaponized false allegations, and terrorized MS. Rivers, all to line your own pockets." Janet stammered, her carefully constructed lies unraveling before everyone's eyes. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. The neighbors who had supported Janet now looked at her with a mix of disbelief and anger. They had been pawns in her scheme, and they knew it. The judge ruled swiftly. The lawsuit against Courtney was dismissed in its entirety, and Janet was ordered to pay for Courtney's legal fees and the damages caused by her harassment. But it didn't stop there. The judge referred the case to the district attorney's office for further investigation into Janet's dealings with the developer, citing potential fraud and conspiracy. Janet's smug confidence was gone, replaced by a pale, shaken expression as she realized the full extent of the consequences she now faced. As the courtroom emptied, Courtney felt a wave of relief wash over her. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for weeks was finally lifting. Elise placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did it," she said. "It's over." But as Courtney walked past Janet on her way out, she caught a glimpse of something in her eyes: not defeat, but simmering anger. Janet leaned in just slightly, her voice low and venomous. "This isn't over, sweetheart," she hissed. "You'll regret this." Courtney didn't flinch. She met Janet's gaze with steady resolve and replied, "No, Janet. You're the one who's going to regret it." Stepping outside into the crisp afternoon air, Courtney took a deep breath and felt the tension in her shoulders finally ease. She had won the battle, but she knew Janet well enough to understand that the fight might not be entirely over. Still, for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could reclaim her home, her peace, and her life. In the weeks following the court's decision, the neighborhood began to settle into an uneasy quiet. Janet's defeat had sent ripples through the community. Those who had once blindly followed her lead now avoided her entirely, their faith in her charm and authority shattered by the revelations in court. Courtney, however, didn't let her guard down. She had learned the hard way that Janet was not someone who gave up easily, even when cornered. The first step in moving forward was undoing the damage Janet had caused. Courtney hired a contractor to repaint her driveway, replacing the hateful red graffiti with a clean, polished surface. She had the pool fully cleaned and restored, ensuring that it was once again safe and pristine. The cameras and floodlights she had installed stayed in place, a permanent reminder of the vigilance she needed to maintain. She also expanded her garden, planting new flowers and shrubs to reclaim the space as her own, a small but meaningful act of defiance against the months of turmoil she had endured. Word of Janet's downfall spread quickly. Neighbors who had avoided Courtney during the conflict began reaching out to apologize. Some sent notes or small gifts, while others stopped by in person, sheepishly admitting they had been misled by Janet's lies. One elderly couple, the Hendersons, confessed that Janet had threatened to expose personal secrets about them if they didn't support her crusade against Courtney. Their words confirmed what Courtney had suspected all along: Janet's influence had been built on manipulation and fear, not genuine concern for the neighborhood. Despite their apologies, Courtney kept her distance. The wounds Janet had inflicted on her sense of trust and safety were still fresh. While she appreciated the gestures, she knew it would take time to feel comfortable in the community again. Trust, she reminded herself, wasn't something she could rebuild overnight. Meanwhile, Janet's world began to crumble. Investigations into her dealings with the real estate developer uncovered further evidence of fraud and corruption. It turned out that Courtney hadn't been Janet's first target. Several other families in the neighborhood had been pressured into selling their homes at reduced prices under similarly suspicious circumstances. Many of them came forward after hearing about Courtney's victory, their stories adding fuel to the growing case against Janet. Facing mounting legal troubles and complete social ostracism, Janet put her house on the market. Within a month she was gone, leaving behind an empty home and a fractured reputation. No one in the neighborhood missed her. The relief was palpable, and for the first time since moving in, Courtney felt like she could breathe. To celebrate the end of Janet's reign, Courtney decided to host a small gathering at her house. It wasn't a grand event, just a few neighbors, some light refreshments, and the soothing sound of the pool's water feature bubbling in the background. It was her way of reclaiming her space, not just for herself but as a symbol of resilience. The Hendersons came, as did a few other neighbors who had been quietly supportive during the ordeal. For the first time, the atmosphere felt genuine, free of the tension that had plagued the community for so long. As the evening wound down, Courtney sat by the pool with a glass of wine, watching the reflection of the string lights dance on the water's surface. The night was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets. For the first time in months, she felt a deep, unshakable peace settle over her. This was her home. She had fought for it, endured more than she thought she could, and come out stronger on the other side. Janet had tried to strip her of everything: her reputation, her safety, her sanctuary, but Courtney had stood firm. She had turned what could have been her breaking point into a testament to her resilience. As she leaned back in her chair, a faint smile tugged at her lips. The battle was over, and she had won not just the legal fight but the right to finally live her life on her own terms. Her home, her oasis, was truly hers again, and she intended to savor every moment of it.